but JavaScript frameworks are built on hope. Hey, what's going on? Welcome to another episode of AngularAir, an Angular story. I'm your host, Justin Schwarzenberger, and today we are going to be talking about techniques for testing within Angular code. So let's get at it. Today, our panelists on the show, we have Victor Mejia joining us. Victor, how's it going?
Hey guys, how's it going?
And we also have Austin McDaniel. Austin?
How's it going? Today I'm not rocking my panda hat. I'm rocking out this sweet panda shower cap I got for Christmas, early Christmas. I was thinking about keeping it on the whole time, but it's actually cutting off the circulation to my head.
Good choice, good choice. We also have Mike Brocky.
Hey, how's it going?
Cool.
No
and then our guest for today's show, really excited to have them here from Down Under. We've got Duncan Hunter. Duncan, how's it going?
Yo, yeah, very good. Very good down here.
And Adam Stephensen.
Hi, guys.
Cool. And they're going to be informing us. We're going to go over some techniques for testing and within Angular and stuff like that. So let's get right to it. First of all, what type of testing are we going to be talking about today? Are you going to be showing? Are we talking like end-to-end tests, unit tests, that sort of thing?
So we're mainly going to focus on having a look at unit tests, but then we'll look at a few different techniques for running unit tests. And then at the end, we're going to have a look at end-to-end, how you can easily write end-to-end tests for your Angular 2 apps.
What are tests?
That's a great question. Yeah, so I think that sparks onto the question, why tests? So tests are extra code that we can write, so we can get lots of benefits and securities in our app for different reasons. So you want to add to that?
I guess it really depends on where you're coming from. We're consultants most of the time, so we actually go and build software for other people. So whether it's going in and building a project from scratch, or whether it's going in and helping other teams build software. And we see a lot of people who waste a lot of time or have a lot of issues shipping their code. And we find that one of the things that really helps them out is getting them a good testing story where they don't need 5 people clicking around their app to have safety and confidence in their app.
Yep.
Good answer, good answer. And so it's kind of a little bit about like why we're testing, right? Like what kind of things are we testing when we're talking about in Angular, in our Angular code?
I think that's a good question. I think that it's a really big spectrum of audience. You've got people who want to go down the TDD path and they do their test-driven development and they want to write all their tests, right there and then as they're writing their code. And then you've got, test kind of as an afterthought or a test during development sort of approach, where you're more sort of, kind of covering the most important parts of your application that are highest risk. So if you have like mission critical business logic in some sort of algorithms on your front end or some sort of logic that you want to cover and make sure that it's working, then, that's the kind of the obvious stuff to test. Or, the purchase button, you want to make sure that purchase button works, because without the purchase button, your whole site might become useless. Whereas, so it depends really on the people and what they want to test in the team. We've got some teams, one client in particular of ours, where they're like, yep, we want 100% code coverage. And that's just kind of written down in law for that project. And then we've got other projects where it's not as much.
Is that actually achievable though?
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting scenario because often, where 100% code coverage is usually generally frowned upon because it's mandated by management, and then developers will work out how to game it to get 100% code coverage. Where this is a highly complex project where that mandate actually came from the team. And so it's really interesting looking at that project and the difference 100% code coverage when it's got when it's really buy-in from the guys writing the complex code driving it. So they're really focused on code quality, and they have code really rigorous code reviews. So it's a different look at 100% code coverage than what I've seen before. So yeah.
It's not all sunshine. There's definitely some expletives that come out of some of the team members on that project who feel like, and I think almost everyone knows that 100% code coverage is going to be at a certain point where you're going to get diminishing returns. Is it the last 10%, last 20% where it's costing you more than you're getting? And it's interesting listening to that team. I was speaking with the actual product owner of that the other day, and he's going, oh, but now we don't have any problems in knowing what to test. We just test everything. So there's no ambiguity or problems. We just test everything. But yeah, it's an interesting project. Yeah. I think diminishing returns is the word there. It's not always benefit all the way to the end.
Yeah, usually I see 80% coverage.
Yeah, 80's a baseline. We've got, let me see, like 90, 98 in a project, but yeah, 100% it's pretty difficult. So that's pretty cool. Would you, so with TDD, would you guys say you guys do the test driven or more test during development? I mean, I often find, like, say with things that are just code, like services, doing a TDD session, it's much easier than doing UI components. So what does that look like for you guys? I mean, do you guys do TDD for UI components too, or do you guys, is it more of an afterthought of just trying to, check that your coverage is green there? So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I think so. I think it depends on the code. It depends. Personally, I find it depends on the code I'm writing. If I'm writing complex code around, quoting calculations or something, I think TDD really helps me develop the code in that scenario. So I think then I'll go into, TDD is really going to help me here. But I think TDD is also a journey. I think, testing is a journey. I think depending on where you're at on that scale depends. I love working with guys who that's just how they roll. And everything they write is TDD, where I'm kind of, somewhere in the middle of that scale. So,
right, yeah.
I find it weird trying to do TDD with a component. Like I kind of think more naturally to go, I'm going to make a component and then test it, because a lot of the time the testing's less complex sometimes in a way. So I know for me, I kind of, when it comes to UI bits in terms of, buttons and so forth, that's more something I'll do afterwards or during but that's just me. Yeah.
It's probably worth calling out as well. This is just because we work on another client project. We've got, it's a very big team with probably 30 devs on it. And there's one guy who writes everything TDD, and so he ships less code than everybody else on the team. But everybody else on the team is really happy for him to do that because everything that he ships is awesome. So, I think that's, once again, it comes back to that journey.
But he's the only one.
But he's the only one on that team of like 30 devs who is TDD across everything.
I'm still looking for someone like that to write my test for me. Real quick though, that brings up a good point, and this is totally off topic. There is actually a new React plugin that writes tests for you based on it failing, erroring. So every time it errors, it like prints the console log of the test that you should write there for you.
Wow, that's a great idea.
Huh.
So your regressions are, you automatically have those regression tests. Yeah, that's cool.
So one of the things that I do when I teach testing to our team and other people, I've learned over time that it's really kind of comes down to, there's an art to writing tests, right? That's different from how we architect software. And to get people to think in that mindset of, you're not writing software here. You're not solving software problems when you're writing these unit tests. You're actually doing this different paradigm. And I think it's important to think in that manner so you can write not only well-crafted tests that cover, but also tests that you can maintain over time, because that's that diminishing return, right, that I think that comes into play. And you start writing tests for all the things and you start doing it in a certain way, then all of a sudden you become this maintenance thing over time, and the return value goes down. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I think for sure. I think there's a certain point where you start doing so much testing that it becomes this, it reverse affects your code. You don't architect your application into smaller pieces because it makes it better. You start doing it because you're thinking about how to test, and it becomes, I'll make this service purely so I can import it into a test versus actually having my, for the application. So yeah, I think for sure you got to think about it very differently and come towards it in a testing mindset, and not just kind of so I can get the tests done.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, when you're talking about, you come back to the traditional testing pyramid kind of idea of having I'm a big fan of having lots of small unit tests that only exercise that particular component of code. So that I know then when I'm refactoring a particular section of code, I know that the only tests they're going to break are the ones associated directly with that component. So I think, so what you're saying is about, once again, you're talking about a journey and testing maturity and having someone who can not just have a look at all the tests that the team's writing and kind of push them in the right direction, I think is really valuable.
But having this level of isolated tests is great, but you also need to consider the levels of integration. So once you get those each isolated pieces, how do you then take that to the next level of how the pieces fit together?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and how do you go from small bits to bigger bits, and how does the team like to roll? I know Steve and I see things a little different there. Like, I'm just really happy to save lives and stop people doing manual testing at work. And if I can do that, I'm really psyched. So I'm more focused on that. So I like to roll a little bit closer where we're actually exercising more of our code, and I'm not so worried about being as isolated as Steve-O, just because we do have manual testers on our projects, and that's their job, just to sit there and click buttons for us. And the more we have a culture of testing and the more we kind of have teams who are skilled up on it, the better we can do. So isolated is really fantastic and it's a great way to go, but not at the cost. Like, I don't know. I feel there's like a spectrum you can be on where you're thinking, I'll exercise more of my code and I don't mind running slower and more real because it's kind of covering more versus, purely being really isolated and very purist about the way you take it.
What's the difference between you guys have been talking a lot about unit tests, but what about end-to-end, and can you kind of explain the difference there and where we should use which?
Cool. Yeah. So, my background's in server-side code and that kind of thing, where the pure unit test and getting the purity of your test was gold, and then and we didn't really write. I've spent the last 10 years kind of going, you don't test your front end at all because why would you bother? That's just dumb. That's just dumb code. And I know, but that's completely different now. Obviously, we're writing more and more logic in our front end. So the front end is so important to get tested now. So I kind of sit in the camp of write really good isolated tests, right? Lots of shallow tests to integrate those pieces, and then have end-to-end tests, just testing your critical paths to make sure that because the end-to-end tests are going to break more often than your unit tests. So I kind of roll going, let's have a couple of big end-to-end tests testing our critical paths and leave everything else at a really isolated level.
Yeah, but interestingly, I think we see at the moment this trend, especially when people are getting into ngRx and Redux, where they're going more towards end-to-end tests. So we're just starting to see that here, where we've got companies that are like, this really large team we're talking about that we're involved with about 30 front-end devs. Most of their tests are end-to-end tests, and they're doing ngRx, and they're finding that they would prefer to spend more of their time doing that than writing unit tests, because a lot of their application is pushed towards having a lot more presentational components, and that's just the pattern they're going down. And I'm hearing that more and more, where people go, oh, I'll just test my reducers and not test all these other components that really are just data binding or emitting events, and then I'll write end-to-end tests. So it's not that we're seeing people do that 100%, but we're definitely hearing that more and more from people, that they're liking to do that sort of approach. And I think people find end-to-end tests, if they're not a heavy testing team, or they're a mix, like they're a full stack sort of team where everyone on the team is a mixture of both, then the end-to-end tests tend to make sense for them. But they're definitely the ones that seem to be thrown out first as well.
Where do you guys sit on the spectrum?
Cool. Can we can show some stuff? Let's get into some code and stuff. Take a look.
Yeah, definitely. So what we're gonna build today is super complex, and I'll share my screen with you here. Whoa. And I want to go back to my screen.
Inception.
All right, can you guys see that?
Yep.
So today we're going to be writing We've gone and we've written an app with the CLI. We've got these Chuck Norris jokes, and we have a button you can hit and it will bring back another Chuck Norris joke. So this is just a free open API that you can bring into your applications and use, and we get these Chuck Norris jokes. So we really like this as a demo because it's so really simple, but there's a lot here to be able to talk about in terms of testing. So you've got button clicks, you've got binding onto the page with the text here, and you also have in the background, we have a separate Angular service that makes HTTP requests. So we kind of cover off in this, the three things that we really talk to people about what you've got to grok when you're trying to get into Angular 2 unit tests. So really the first thing you've got to understand is how to fake a service. And then the second thing you've got to be really good at understanding is being able to use the new testbed API so that you can get all your modules and your dependencies set up. And then the third thing is kind of understanding how to use some of the new utilities around async and fake async. So we're going to jump into all of those things today, having a look at this very simple little jokes app. So I'm going to jump over into Visual Studio Code, and
I just call out the reason we like a simple app for teaching testing is there's a lot to grok in the testing area. So we find, originally we started teaching people on real life reactive forms with validation and custom error messages. And they spend so much time trying to grok that the Angular parts of that they actually miss the importance of the testing parts.
Yeah, absolutely. So we really like something dead simple to talk over, because it means the conversations about how do you test and how do you achieve things, especially when you're looking at getting up to speed on using some of the new things in Angular 2, because there's a fairly big change and there's lots of awesome new utilities, but there's a learning curve involved in learning those. So in our folder, if we have a look at the directory over here, we've just got a new Angular CLI project, and we've gone and made a Chuck Norris module, which has just a joke component in it and a joke service.
Duncan, can you zoom in on that? In code?
How's that?
A couple more? Maybe one or two more?
How's that? Okay. So if we have a look over here, we have got a joke component, and it's pretty simple. What we have is a couple of properties at the top. We've got a joke as a string, and we've got a title for the page, which is Chuck Norris jokes. Interestingly to remember is we've got this joke service, so we're going to have to fake out this joke service when we go to write some tests. And when we initialize this component, we call this getJoke method, and it calls our service, our joke service, and it just brings back a random joke from our API and binds that onto the joke property. So pretty simple to kind of understand and move forward. If we come over back into the directory here, we've got an empty joke.component.spec.ts. So we're going to jump into here, and we're going to spend most of the time in here looking at how to test this simple page. So we're going to start off by just doing some of the world's simplest tests, and then we're going to move through talking about mocking the service and using Jasmine, which is a testing framework for doing spies and other sorts of things. So let's jump into the very simplest thing we could do, which would be adding a Jasmine the Scribe block. And I guess it kind of brings us to the point of talking about tools. We're huge fans of the Angular CLI for heaps of reasons. Actually, I'd say go as far as to say we love it because it just makes our lives a lot more efficient. But in particular for the testing and having the testing set up out of the box. So out of the box, we're going to get Jasmine for doing assertions and the syntax we're seeing here, plus spies and other things. But we're also going to get a test runner with Karma and Protractor and all of that set up. So that's already done and already plumbed into this project. So I'm going to come into the top here, and we're describing a component. So this describe block is going to obviously be talking about a suite of tests. So inside of this block, we can put in a description. So here we're talking about the joke component, and our joke component describe block is going to have multiple it statements in here. So it statements, we might have multiple ones of these. And I'm going to start off with something really simple. I'm just going to say should add 1 + 1. And we'll wind up and get into more tests in a second that are a bit more complicated than this one. And I'm just going to do a Jasmine expectation and say I expect 1 + 1 to equal, and I'll make it fail at first 1. And I'm actually giving away a bit of a a surprise there on the left in the test runner we like to use when we're doing our tests in Visual Studio Code, which is Wallaby, but we'll come back to that in a second. I'm going to open up the terminal here and run the tests using Karma, which is the test runner out of the box for the CLI. So ngTest, and we can run this in the terminal here. We're expecting this to fail because obviously that's not the correct answer. 1 + 1 = 1. We know it's going to equal 2. So we're getting our error output here in the bottom, and this is great to have all plumbed in, but we find we get a lot of use out of using a tool called Wallaby. So if I come into the extensions here, I'll bring it up on the page. So Wallaby.js is an inline test runner for your IDE, and you get it in multiple IDEs like WebStorm and Visual Studio proper. And it allows you to get this inline feedback, which we'll show you now. And it has a whole bunch of other useful tools. So I'm going to come in and actually kill the terminal at the bottom here and close that down. And I'm just going to start Wallaby. Oh. We're going to just kick off Wallaby, and you'll see down here on the bottom, it's kind of spinning away and showing that it's loading it in the status bar. And when it fires up, this tool is going to give us inline feedback on the left. So we can see here straight away that this is failing. We've got a red dot on the left, and then it inlines the expectation on the right, which we find super useful for writing tests, and also super fast to get feedback, because if I change that into a passing test, then it just instantly updates on the screen for us. So we're going to be using that today. And the other cool thing about it is if we jump over to the browser, it's also got a code coverage tool. So here in the browser, in real time, it kind of keeps up to date with your application. And you can see we've got this Chuck Norris joke that's been added, should add 1 + 1 here. So if you haven't seen it before, it's worth checking out. It is a paid product, costs about $100, which not everybody likes the idea of, but we love it.
Are you getting commission? Are you getting commission?
No commission. He is from our local town though, so.
But we both paid the $100, and we've been using it for quite a while now, and it's one of those things where it's like it's one of those tools. Like I use ReSharper in my other IDE all the time, and I just find it's a no-brainer for the productivity boost that you get to spill out a couple of $100 for these tools.
So let's move forward here.
I've got a quick question for you, Duncan and Adam. Are you guys? Do you guys have patterns, or the companies that you're consulting with have patterns for what you put for these describes and these if statements, or do people just kind of wing it and put what they want in there?
Depends on our C# code. We have more patterns on the recent test we've had on the front end. We haven't had as much of a pattern around it.
It also depends on, I think, it keeps coming back to, testing being a journey. And it depends on what the background of the team is. A lot of teams that we work with are coming from a focus on back-end and back-end testing into front-end testing. So they're more familiar with, an arrange, act, assert, and kind of the naming patterns in back-end. And they're just moving into BDD. But then we've got other people who are right into BDD and are following those kind of best practices. But I think the naming is something that teams come to after they've actually learnt the tools a little, because there's so much to learn on the tools that we try not to overwhelm them with too much stuff.
And then one more question about formatting tests. So do you treat, so, with ES6 and TypeScript, we have a class for each component. So do you, so what I like to do is, we have methods on the component, and then, so I usually have a nested block for, functions inside the component. So inside, we have the outer describe, and then inside of this, I will be, describe, function name, and then I would have tests describing those functions. So I know, so do you guys do that, or, because with Jasmine, you can, you have BDD style tests where you can sort of, write your test in a format that, goes with like the, the acceptance criteria, as opposed, I guess Yeah, so do you write your tests like that, or do you write your tests like as one big describe block and then a bunch of specs describing what this component should do?
No, I think this is a bit of a demo example here. What I like to do is I like to have nested describes, if that's what you're saying. So I kind of, within one describe, I might have more describes in there and sets of suites in those.
Right.
And I kind of like to push as much like the logic into a before each, so I can kind of keep my if statements mostly to just kind of doing expectations. But so that's how I like to roll. So we kind of end up having like, yeah, nested ones inside of there, so it's not just this huge block of if statements.
Right, right.
But on the other hand, I think it's a good indicator once you end up with too many levels of nesting, you need to come back to, you know, single responsibility principle, and often that's an indicator that once it starts going a bit mad, that maybe you need to do some refactoring. So once the tests require a certain level of complexity, it often indicates that the code that it's testing has too many responsibilities. So it's kind of the refactoring, it's an indicator that a refactoring is needed. So I like them, but you know, you don't want to see a team going too crazy with them.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So we're not following any major patterns here. What we'd really like to do today is actually to show off some of the new testing utilities with Angular. So we're going to do one more simple test, and that's kind of going to lead us into talking about some of these new utilities. So you hear people at the moment talking about these isolated and shallow tests in Angular 2, talking, say, you know, an isolated test is something that's just kind of testing the JavaScript or the TypeScript around a component and isn't actually utilizing the HTML template or the DOM. Whereas a shallow test would be looking at the component, but also including, you know, exercising the HTML and being able to query it and interact with it. So we're going to do a quick isolated test here before we move on to talking about some shallow tests. So in this one here, I'm going to make a property called component. And I'm just going to new up in line here a new joke component that we saw before. And I've got an auto importer that's just going to stick the import statements at the top of the screen here as we go, you can see. But if we have a look at this joke component has a dependency on the joke service. And we're going to come back and talk about the different ways that we can fake that out. But for now, I'm just going to pass in null to get this to work for us, because I just want to be able to access the components logic. So next thing I can do is an expectation with Jasmine again. And in here, I can say I'm going to expect that my component dot title is going to be equal to, and you can see I get this inline feedback, which we really like about Wallaby. So it's just going to be Chuck Norris jokes. So this is just a really simple way of being able to new up a component and to be able to deal with it. And we don't mind this sort of isolated approach when we're dealing with services and simple things, but we'll come back over this and we'll start talking about the test bed. But I really like TypeScript for being able to test. It's something I've found is very different from coming from Angular 1 into Angular 2. Even though we did a lot of TypeScript, it was always kind of a battle, whereas, you know, writing your tests in Angular 2 and TypeScript just feels like it's meant to be, which is really nice. It's so much handier exploring all the APIs that are available now and just your own code there with the component.title.
Awesome. Cool. So I'm going to take it to the next. I'm just going to I'm going to just say I'm going to finish that title of. I'm just going to check. This test is about the title. Now the next test I'm going to write is going to be about. So when we have a look at our component. When we have a look at the component, we can see that what's happening in the component is when the component is initialized, we're calling this .getJoke, and that's calling out to our joke service, and it's returning a joke and it's assigning a joke to the joke property on our joke component. So the next test that I'm going to write is going to say, I want to be able to test that that's actually happening correctly. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to say that it should set the joke property when the component is initialized. And my shortcut keys are all different.
I'm making Adam drive my computer today.
So what I can do here, so when I'm saying I'm going to come in here and I'm going to check this joke property, I want to actually exercise that ng on init function. I could come in here and actually create a new component the same way that Duncan has in the previous test. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to move this up and I'm going to refactor it so that I can let these tests share the component initialization. So this is where I'll bring, so I'm going to come up to the top of my describe block and I'm going to introduce a property for the component. And I'm going to have one, and I'm going to have another one for my, and we can joke service that's getting injected. Okay, and another great part of Jasmine is I can actually run a before each here, so I can refactor this to use yeah. Okay, so now I've got my before each. So I can come in here and I can actually go, my component instantiation comes in here and I can say new joke component. Okay, and then Duncan was just passing in a false here, but I'm actually going to need, because the service that I'm testing, I actually want to make sure it's getting back that service. So I actually need to actually start using the joke service in this test. And there's a couple of ways that we can do this. One of the ways that we can do it is that we can actually create a fake service and declare the fake service in this class and use that fake. The other way we can do it is to get a real handle on the real service and then override the method that's actually returning a joke. So what I'm going to do in here is I'm going to actually create a fake service on the fly. I'm going to come in here and go so I'm going to have my joke service. I'm going to say that my joke service is an object. I'm going to come in and then on my object, I'm going to come in, I'm going to say there's a get joke method. And I'm going to say that that method does, all that get joke method does is return an observable of a fake joke. Okay, so now, and then I can pass this one that I've just created, I can actually pass this into my, my component. So here's my service. Now this is getting me an error because I don't have of. For the sake of the demo, I'm just going to import the RxJS kitchen sink. So I can let that pass. Okay, so now I've got my, so now what I've done is I'm going, and before every test, I'm actually creating a fake joke service and then I'm instantiating my component and pasting that fake joke service in, and it's going to return me an observable of fake joke whenever I call get joke. So now that I'm doing that, I can come down into my test and I can actually come in and call component.ng on init. So I'm doing that.
And that code's running before each of these it statements, right? Like it's creating a brand new component, a brand new service for each of these ones individually?
Exactly. And then I'm going to come in and I'm going to check to make sure that the joke that is being set, is actually equal to what I specified it was going to be in my fake. So if I come in here and put in a failing test, you can see that it's giving me the red on the side. But if I come in and change it to what I said it was going to be on the fly, you can see it's going to go to green immediately. Oh. So I can see I'm now actually testing that ng on init is going out and calling the service, but we're specifying what that service should return, and then I'm checking to make sure that that property is being set. Now,
so this is one approach to being able to fake out that service, and it's really interesting looking through other people's code and looking at the way people like to do it, because this is a valid approach to do it in line like this. But we could also pass in the real service, and we could use something like a spy method from Jasmine to intercept the request to this get joke function. So we're going to show you this way of approaching it now, and we're going to pass in the real service. But it kind of also brings us on to the next part of talking about the testbed API in Angular 2. So we're going to implement the testbed API now, and then in doing that, what we will do is we'll pass in the real service, and then we'll add a Jasmine spy. So things are going to get a little bit more complicated than what we've got here, but it's going to start to look a little bit more real world. So the testbed's kind of that second thing that we talk about being, the complex thing that people have to get their head around when they start doing testing with Angular 2, because there's a fair bit in it, and there's a fair bit to learn. So when I talk about a testbed, it's easy to see it. So I'll stub it out, and then you'll probably see that it looks very much like an Angular module, and that's what the the testbed really is. It's one big part of it is it specifies all the dependencies you need to be able to run tests around the test subject. And in this case, that's the joke component. So I'm going to come remove all of Steve-O's work here, or I'll just comment out this newing up of the component here in line. And I'm going to bring in the testbed, and we can have a look at what that looks like when we go to do a configure. We're going to configure the testing module. So that is very much like dealing with an ng module. You've got a set of different things that you can pass in to say, I've got this section of code and here are all of its dependencies. So if you've done an Angular module, this will look very familiar. So we've got declarations, which will describe all of the different components that we might want to pass in. And in this case, we just want to pass in the joke component. And then we're going to have a couple of things that we need for the Angular service there, that we have this joke service. So I'm going to, in the imports here, I'm going to pass in the HTTP module, because if we have a look at our joke service, we'll see that it's using HTTP to make a request to the backend there. And then underneath here, I can pass in the providers, and the providers is setting up registering all the services that we need for this test. And this is where things get a little bit more interesting. So in the providers here, I could just pass in the real service and just say, great, I'm just going to pass in the joke service like so, and then I've got access to it, and then I can inject it later on. So this is one approach, and we're going to follow this now. But the other thing, actually, that's the local one. Let's pass in the real one here. So we could pass in this joke service like so. But a really common thing you'll see people doing is like a combination of this. So rather than doing it in this way, what I could do, I'll just do it quickly. I can pass in object and say, I want to provide this joke service, but when I pass in this joke service, I want you to use a different value. So this is a really common strategy for being able to override that joke service with a fake like we've got already built here from Adam. So I can say use value and then pass in the joke service that we created locally here. So in this way, now anytime anyone asks for this joke service, they're actually really going to get this joke service. But for now, I want to show the alternate approach to doing a fake like this and actually use the real value. And it's a bit arbitrary in this example here for what we're doing today, because what I would normally do if I was going to use the real service and a Jasmine spy to intercept the call out to this get joke, what I would do is also fake the HTTP backend so that I don't accidentally call through to the backend if I forget to intercept all the requests. So I'm going to get rid of this, pass back in our real joke service here. And then I've got to do a couple of other things. So one of the big changes when you start using the testbed and you configure a testing module like this is it gives you a handle on a fixture. So I'm going to come up the top here and I'm going to add that into our property. So I'm going to say let fixture of type component fixture, and that type of that will be of our joke component. So this fixture is really gives us an ability to get an instance on this component again without newing it up. But also the really big difference here with this fixture is the fixture gives us an instance of the component, but it also gives us access to the debug element. And when we have that, we can get the HTML template for the component or the DOM. So that's a really big difference doing it this way than just newing up the component, because now when we have the HTML template, then we can query it and we can actually check that the business logic that drives it in our component is actually doing what we think it does on the actual HTML. So underneath our test bed here in our before each, we can, I'm just going to comment this out for now, this one here. We can come in and initialize this fixture. I'm going to just move the before each down. Oops. Oh, bear with me for a sec. Here it is. There's the bottom of it there. So underneath the test bed, configuring up the module here, I'm just going to initialize our fixture that we had here, and I'm going to ask the test bed now to create me a component. So this is, rather than newing it up here, this is where we can say, you can say that we want to pass in this joke component. So now we've got a handle on a fixture. What we can do with that is we can get a handle on the actual component again and kind of close out this loop of refactoring and say the component equals the fixture, and the fixture has off of it a component instance here. So now we have the component instance, but one thing we're missing is we don't actually have the joke service yet. So we've registered here in the module for this test per se, but what we need to do next in here is actually get the joke service. So this joke service, you can get it in a couple of different ways, but the newer way, or one way of doing it, is to actually ask the test bed for it. So we can get the test bed to inject that for us by saying testbed.get is a short way of doing it, and pass in here the joke service like so. And I actually know that this most likely will pass. It's probably just that I just need to restart Wallaby. So if you see down the bottom here, I just use the keyboard shortcut to trigger Wallaby off again, and it's refreshing down here on the bottom. And now we've reset this component object that we're using in the jokes, and it's working and it's passing on our check for the title. But down here, we're going to refactor what Adam did before, and I'm just going to get rid of this and change it to use a spy method.
So instead of actually instantiating the object and calling ng on in it, now we're going to actually use the, so instead of newing up an instance of the component and actually creating an instance of the class, we're going to get the component from the test bed. And, and that's the test bed, and that's the test bed is the big, like one of the big parts of Angular 2 testing to learn. And they're just going to reiterate that the main benefit about getting the component from the test bed instead of newing it up is then now we're also able to get a handle on the view and to actually test the template. And we're also able to get to make changes to the service and then actually get the service that's going to be used by the test bed and get a handle on that as well.
Yep. And
so,
go on. We also had a look a second ago at being able to take this commented out fake joke service here that we've got in line. But now we're passing in the real joke service. We don't actually want to call the real thing. What we want to do is intercept any requests to the service. So I'm going to make a Jasmine spy here, and I'm actually going to spy on our joke service. And if anyone calls the get joke method here on this joke service that we have, we want to intercept it, and we can do lots of things with that. We could, check how many times it's being called and what values and so forth. So we're going to do that here and go return value. So we're going to intercept the request and we're going to return our own value in this, and that value is going to be similar to what we saw before. We're going to do an observable of, and I'm just going to pass in a string so we can see it in line, fake joke. Now, anytime we call out to the service, we're going to intercept it and pass that back. So now I've done that, I can come in and make my expectation. So I can say, I expect that the component .joke property is going to equal the return value there that we just set above, so fake joke. But this actually isn't going to pass because we haven't actually initialized our component yet. And this is where the fixture that gives us, lots of things that we got from the test bed can help us out. And we can ask it to detect changes and run a round of change detection for us on our component. So we can say fixture.detect changes, and then this will trigger a round of change detection, which will trigger off our ng on init, and then that will set the joke property onto the joke property. So now we've done that, and we've gone through a hell of a lot of headache just to set up this test bed and do other bits here. But now we've got the ability to actually get the DOM and query the DOM. So let's do that in the next test. What we're going to do is we're going to add a debug element, and we're going to access the debug element to be able to get a hold of this Chuck Norris likes ice like he likes his skulls crushed string here on the page. And we're going to check that we have what we expect to get, which we'll actually pass in a fake response for. So I'm going to come up to the top of the component here and add in another variable called DE, which is the debug element. And with this debug element, then we can get a hold of the DOM like I was saying. So I'm going to come down underneath and say debug element equals the fixture dot debug element. And when I get this debug element here, I've actually got a choice in whether or not I want to do a query that I'd use multiple times at the top here, like query for something with a CSS selector, or I can actually do it for each test, which we're going to do here. So I'm going to come down into the test and say, and make a new test here underneath. And say that it should have a joke content bound on the page. So should have joke content bound onto the page. Now inside of here, I'm going to use a similar sort of spy-on approach, and I'm going to call fixture.detect changes, which I like to do at the start of all the tests so that it gets the initialization logic run. So here I want to get a query the actual by CSS and get a hold of the actual joke on the page. So to do that, I'm going to set a property called element, and it's going to equal, we've got this debug element now we've initialized, and I can query with that the HTML template related to this component. So I'm going to query by CSS, and there's only one paragraph element on the page, so I can just use that paragraph element. And then I want to get a handle on the native element. So this will allow me to use this element object very much in the way that we're familiar with working with the DOM and querying with CSS selectors and so forth and manipulating it. So once I have that, then I can expect the content is going to equal this fake joke, because the component's going to, on ng on init, will call the get joke method on our service, and we're going to intercept that and pass back the string of fake joke here in capitals. If I come in and go, Jasmine expect that the joke here, which is referencing, oh sorry, it's actually the element here on the page, and look at its text content, then I can check to see that it's going to equal the fake joke that we're passing in here above in the interception. It's a pretty simple test just to check that the content's on the page, but now let's get digging further into the testbed API, and we're seeing how when we get a fixture, we can get this debug element, and with a debug element, then we can start querying our templates, which allow us to do a lot of powerful things.
Which is pretty cool. I think we should probably roll to end-to-end.
Yep. So
so we got a few more minutes here. So
Yep.
yeah, let's check that out real quick, and then we're going to need to wrap up.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to jump over and show you in the directory here the end-to-end tests that we have. So out of the box, we get an E to E folder, and we get all of the end-to-end tests set up with Protractor, which allow us to run the real browser and click it and make assertions. So I'm going to jump into this file here and actually remove the tests that we have.
Unless you use a shell.
Actually, if we've only got a few minutes, I'll just show you this one rather than typing out, save you the time. So if we have a look here at this file, we've got an import statement at the top where we're asking Protractor for a couple of helpers. We want to get browser, we want to get by, and we want to get element so that we can query the page. So the Jasmine's very familiar here again, using Jasmine across both our end-to-end tests and our unit tests. So in the it block here, we're going to say we should have a title of Chuck Norris jokes, which if we come and have a look on the page, we've got the title up here. So the first thing we need to do is we navigate to the page that we want to test. So here we're saying browser.get, and this is just on the root of our URL. So we're just doing a single slash. And then I want to get that title property. So I do another query here with element by CSS, and we're looking for the H1 property on the page or element. And then we're using the get text method there to get the text out of that H1. And then we can do a simple check here to say, I expect my title is going to equal Chuck Norris jokes. So if I move this over to the side of the page here and close this down and open up a terminal window, just clear out the console here, I can run ng e to e to be able to run an end-to-end test using the tool set up by the CLI. And it takes a second to kick off. You know, these tests are very different than the unit tests we saw, and they're designed to solve different problems. So you don't necessarily have a tool to run this live all the time while you change your end-to-end test there. But once it kicks off, it will flash up on the left-hand side and show us the browser and it being manipulated, but it will probably flash so quickly we don't get a good chance of actually understanding, you know, or seeing what it's doing unless we slowed it down.
So while this is loading, I have a quick question. So do you, so an interaction like a click on the button, would you classify that as an end-to-end test? Because in your unit test, you can still query and get the element, click on it, and then, you know, check that a function was called when this button was clicked, right? So do you also include those types of actions in your unit tests?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think it really depends on the team. So, and we like to show this in particular, this test, because it's kind of, you know, clicking on a button is very similar to what we just did in what we could have just done in a unit test. And it really is a flavor for the team to decide on. Some people prefer to put that stuff in an end-to-end test because it feels more natural for them, and not really test their HTML too much in their unit tests and more test kind of their business logic in their JavaScript. So it really depends on the team and what they want to test.
Right.
The way I kind of see it is that in your we have unit tests that can test the TypeScript by themselves in the isolated tests, and we have unit tests that can test we can do the shallow tests that are also testing the DOM and the DOM interactions with our TypeScript class. And I feel like they're all still unit tests, and you still should be testing those in small components. But what we tend to do is that the end-to-end tests are kind of longer running tests that are exercising the application the whole way through, and that they're testing a longer series of, because they're not testing a unit anyway, they tend to be testing a series of interactions.
The other clarification is that with the end-to-end test that you have set up here is that it could be run against any browser as well. So you're also testing other, you could test other browsers as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You could be pushing this to some CI build with a tool like Source Labs that could run it across, you know, our favorites like Internet Explorer and Safari.
Cool.
So that's the end of our demo, guys.
Woo!
Yeah, that was really cool. That was really great. I'm glad we got
I had no idea you guys were up at 5 a.m. So
Yeah.
I'm so excited for being up at 5 too.
Yeah, coffee helps.
Coffee helps.
Yeah, well, you guys definitely brought it. We really appreciated the content that you delivered to us, and yeah, it was awesome. So let's wrap up. Usually do tips and picks, so people can kind of just say some stuff that they've noticed or just decide. You guys got anything for us? Want to share?
Yeah, so I love my new Bose headphones. Since I've gotten the QC35s there, I have hardly taken them off. So they're kind of my favorite new toy. You've got a new toy too that you're loving?
Oh, I love the MacBook Pro. Yeah, I got a new MacBook. That's pretty fun.
Yeah.
I like the gadgets.
my other pick is probably NDC London, which is going to be awesome. So
January.
in January, we're speaking on Angular 2 war stories and unit testing at NDC in London. So it'd be great if anyone's there. Come and say hi. NDC is always an amazing conference. So really looking forward to that.
I really like the testing docs from Angular. There's 99 pages of them. If you actually try and print it out, it's quite a hefty document. But if you look at angular.io and look at their testing docs, they're actually really awesome and really thorough. So whoever wrote those, big thank you.
Yeah. And you'll keep coming back to them and you'll get more every pass through.
Yeah, it's not a 5-minute cup of tea job. Yeah.
Sweet. And so then you just got the one talk coming up, right? Are there other talks that you guys are doing on this stuff you want to plug?
Yeah, actually, I just, if anyone's in Seattle in late January, I'm going to be up there running Angular Hack Day with some of the Google team up there, which should be a lot of fun. So that's the last Sunday of January. Really excited to be back over there in America. I love visiting, so it should be fun. And then
we're around a fair bit. We're at
Ignite
in Australia, and we're back in Copenhagen in February.
Yep, for another NDC.
Yeah. So
Awesome.
come and say hi.
Sweet. Austin, you got anything?
Yeah, so I'm glad you called on me first so Brocco can't steal my pick. Angular 2.4 just dropped, like right before this kicked off. There's some nice bug fixes there. Also, there's a project that just dropped this morning as well called HoloJS, which allows you to use WebGL and JavaScript to build holographic interfaces for HoloLens. So that is super cool.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Okay. Anyone else? Mike, Victor?
I've got a pick. So I lead up the Angular Orange County meetup, and last month our meetup was actually hosted at Google Irvine, and Minko Geshev was actually down here, and he gave an awesome talk. It was recorded, so I'll post a link to that. It was building an Angular app for production, so it talks about like all sorts of optimization. So yeah, I'll post a link to that. So.
Cool. Mike, you still with us?
Yeah, I'm here. I got one. And it actually ties directly in. So all the configuration of the test bed for these tests that we saw set up, we started with an empty file here with today's demo, but those are actually all scaled up for you out of the Angular CLI. So those spec files actually have the test bed already configured up, being able to produce that component for you out of the box.
Which is awesome.
Go CLI. We love it, right?
And I didn't have any issues coming out of today, so I'm happy for that.
So you got no work on your plate. That's good. Next week probably, maybe not. So, but speaking of next week, we've got our episode's going to be with Jeff Cross, and I believe Victor Stephensen is going to join us as well. We're going to be talking about life on and beyond the Angular core team. They're going to talk about their experience while they were on it and talk about their new venture, and should be a great discussion show. So tune in for that. And we'll get all the links and stuff everybody mentioned here up in the episode notes and up on the site here in the next day or two. So thanks a ton to our guests for joining us today, talking about testing. It was really great to have you guys. Duncan, Adam, thank you. And thanks to all our panelists. And everybody have a great week.
Excellent, guys. Thanks heaps.
And happy holidays.
Yeah, happy
Merry
holidays.
Christmas.